one thing, Michael, you began to answer actually one question I'll have that maybe we can explore a little later, which is, how is it that since upstate New York has such an enormous concentration of colleges and universities, I think the biggest in the country, actually bigger even than Massachusetts and larger than California when you include the privates in terms of per capita, that it doesn't do better? You suggested some answers to that. Maybe we can pursue that. But my threshold question, starting down with Heather, down to our responders here, is you all work to a degree with people who are starting businesses or relocating businesses or making business investment decisions. And so I'm curious to start with, how much do indexes of the type we're seeing, lists, comparisons, rankings, indexes and reports such as the one that Jonathan works on, and the competitiveness indexes like the one that David produces, and Forbes lists and magazine articles, best city to live in, et cetera, how much do those types of things actually weigh in, how heavily do you think they're weighed in business investment and location decisions in your experience? To start with you, Heather.
Well, I don't think that they're a major factor for the most part. I mean, I know it's great to say, oh, we were first in Site Selection magazine. I think that happened during the Pataki administration. Oh, yeah. But I think realistically, companies aren't, if they're large companies, they're not going to make a massive investment decision based on, you know, one list or some state rankings. I do think perception is important. So if we're last on every list, that does make a difference. For startups, for entrepreneurs, what people care a lot more about is how hard is it to start the company, and how surprised am I going to be when I try and build a building, or and find out I've got 15 different, you know, regulatory bodies I need to deal with in terms of siting. So I think, and by the way, if someone's a startup and they're using these lists as a way to determine whether or not to locate in New York, I'd like to meet that person because they've got a lot of free time. But no, so I don't think that they're that critical, but I do think what they do is really highlight sort of some themes. And I think, to be frank, I think having come from the state legislature, I think they're very useful to policymakers because they do highlight areas where we can see room for improvement, and I'll go back to my point, which was taxes matter. We need to take a look at getting rid of some of these sort of individual discrete taxes, taxes on energy, taxes on library districts. Stop that and start reversing sort of the proliferation of ways and new creative ideas of how to generate tax revenue. So I know that's not really an answer to your question, but
no, actually it is. Mike?
I know that for existing members that I have, particularly those that are heavily engaged and involved, well, taking one quick step back, I always, when I go out and I travel, and I'm doing that right now, and talk to members, my team will always tell me to make sure I dumb it down a little bit in terms of politics when you try to give a legislative update, and then I'm always very surprised over and over again that they know exactly what I'm talking about before I even try to get to dumb it down. I know a lot of members, particularly on my board, have rich state, poor state, and reference that to me all the time, both when the new one comes out and they'll tell me, but those are existing. I think I agree with Heather, and a point that I wanted to make before that correlates pretty well with this is the fix is legislative, regulatory, the stuff that the governor could do by himself, duplicative reporting requirements, why the state mandates or minimums or exceed what the federal minimums are, and a variety of regulations, particularly with the EPA and environmental things, but also the whole perception. And Brian talked about the toll hike. You know, every time you go and you talk to a business owner or somebody who is, and they start going through that maze of filling out this paperwork or that to try to set up a business, and they hit roadblock after roadblock after roadblock, it feeds the beast that's the anti-business reputation of the state, or the state agencies are out to get me. So then when the Thruway Authority called the toll hike modest, every member I had, that because it impacts everyone, screams because it's insensitive and shows a lack of clarity to what a public policy issue can have on a business existing. And frankly, I mean, every trucking industry, I'm not going to get on my soapbox about the toll hike, but it's going to have a bad impact. So for those of you who are involved, make your voice heard. I just think that there needs to be an understanding that the state agencies have a role. They can be enforcement and they can be sensible, but they can also be economic development tools. They can help prop up existing business or help promote New York as a state to invest, just as much or more than any ranking can.
Okay, Brian?
Yeah, EJ, I think the The answer to your question is yes and no.
Move the mic over to you, please, Brian.
From the no perspective, I think if somebody's going to create a small business, a service industry, a restaurant, a bar, something along those lines, I don't think these statistics make much of a difference because they're going to do that anyway. However, I think they have a profound impact on businesses that are already here that are looking to expand. They do want to know what's going on and what does this mean and how is New York competitive. And I think to Michael's point, and even on, to some of the stuff we heard, it matters to investors. Because if you think about it, if you're going to invest your money into a company, and we see this quite a bit from an angel side, just a general investment, we're seeing that money come into New York State from Boston, from California. When it comes in, there's almost a caveat that says, we're going to invest in this, but you're going to move it. And you're going to move it to California, or you're going to move it to somewhere else where that investor has a greater opportunity to get a better return on their investment. So I think it matters on the expansion, the attraction, and on the investment side.
Okay. Michael?
Well, for me personally, these really bad rankings are a godsend for my job security, because how in the world could I be effective at my job with all these negative hurdles I must leap over? So more seriously, I think they are a concern, because as our companies grow in New York State, and they're often acquired by out-of-state parent companies, sometimes out-of-country parent companies, and they read this stuff. The parent companies do. So when a local company is ready to make an investment decision, they go to the parent company, make the pitch, it can have an impact on the success of their presentation. Case in point, we had a 600 employee unit of Emerson in our community left a couple of years ago, all 600 people, and the parent company said, we're paying 3 times the cost of electricity in New York State than we are in our Maysville, Kentucky operation, which is very similar.
3 times in Tompkins County.
Right.
Because I think we all know that Con Ed and Long Island are the most expensive electricity rates in the country, pretty much. But in Tompkins County,
it was 3x, and they look at those kind of metrics, and they're influenced by the negative input they get.
I do have some other questions, but I want to give the people in the audience a chance too. Can we get some questions for the panelists or for our presenters? Okay, I have another one that goes a somewhat different take, and I want to ask our presenters this, and then we'll give you a chance to comment. But to start with, David, your index, which is a competitiveness index, you explain your measures pretty well, and your index shows, among other things, that Massachusetts is very competitive, and that New York is sort of competitive. And what I wanted to ask you in terms of both those states is, because in the long term, neither one of those states, and I mean in the long term, 40 to 50 years, are growing really particularly well. They're losing people, and they're not adding jobs. In the last couple of years, they've had a less than bad recession. But in the long term, they're not high growth states. So how does being competitive, in the sense I think I understand you're calling it, jive with not growing?
A big reason we're not growing is because of zoning laws that make it impossible to get affordable real estate anywhere in Massachusetts. Well, perhaps in Western Mass, where housing prices just came down a lot, but if you live in the suburbs around Boston, it's very hard to build a house on a lot smaller than, say, an acre in size. The Tony suburbs like Lexington and Concord, even though they're quite liberal in their philosophy, just don't want people around them. And it's a tough problem, housing, the cost of housing in Massachusetts. I think that's one reason why we're not getting people. We don't take that indicator into consideration in building our index. Maybe we should. And I agree with EJ's implication that this is something of a paradox. There is something going on in Massachusetts, though, that people do like to live there, the ones that can afford to move into the state. And we have high wages to go along with our relatively high cost of living, and it seems to have sort of settled down. In terms of population, I think there's some small population growth. I know the population growth is taking place rather slowly. We're not hemorrhaging population like California in distinction with that experience. And the best explanation I can give for why we can't get people is the cost of housing. And the fact is, we talk a lot about it. There are affordable housing laws. If you're going to develop something in Massachusetts, you have to put up some low rent units someplace to pacify the regulators, but it's still very expensive and it's not getting any better.
Do you have an observation on that, Jonathan, before I get to?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you're going to find the paradox type situations occasionally when you come to the rankings, and we have several states where they're not performing like we think they probably could, given the current dynamics in our rankings as well. There's certainly a lot of ways to explain that. There's a lot of other factors going on there. I mean, obviously neither David nor our index attempt to explain 100% of what goes on out there. We just think that we focused on some of the very important variables. And to the earlier question, I was going to make a comment on is I think I would totally agree that perception, once you get to a critical mass of several indices in the 50 range or the 45 to 50 range would certainly play a matter. The other thing I think I would point out, though, is I would love a world where everybody in the country read Rich States, Poor States, and they bought multiple copies for families and friends and everything. By the way, it's available on our website if you're interested in a copy. However, not everybody is, but the thing that matters is businesses may not, fail to move to New York because of their 50th ranking in Rich States, Poor States, but what they will do is fail to move to New York because of the marginal tax rates, because of the other incentives or disincentives in this case that New York has embedded within its policy. And those are the things that we hope to measure, and I think we do a fairly good job at measuring the incentive side of it.
Well, one thing nobody has talked about, and we've talked about marginal tax rates, by which we usually mean the personal income tax. Some other studies have suggested, including one, David, you may be familiar with, that David Newmark and two other guys did at the University of California, was suggested that looking at all of these indexes, that an underweighted factor in all of them was corporate taxes, and that corporate taxes deserve more attention. I know it's something that Heather thinks about and deals about a lot at the Business Council. Perhaps I'll start with you, Heather, is how are we doing there, and how important are corporate taxes, which often seem to get forgotten in this discussion?
Well, I would have two answers to that. One is the national and one is the state. At the national level, we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. And at the same time that people are complaining about companies not moving their assets back to the US, we have this tremendous disincentive for companies to onshore resources. And I would argue that a lot of these companies, and many of whom are my members, would be very happy to repatriate resources and funds back to the U.S. if they weren't paying a 15% penalty. And by the way, if they're publicly traded, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to not do that. So there's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is, the corporate tax rate is a problem for successful companies in New York. And my personal view and the view of the Business Council is creating, little pockets of exemptions or breaks is not a systemic solution. You have to take down the whole rate, and that's one of the areas where we think there's room for improvement. I know we're not the worst in the country on the corporate tax rate, but when you factor in our high property taxes, which are the largest, and for folks in the room who don't know this, the largest property taxpayer in the city of New York is a utility. The largest property taxpayer in the state of New York is a utility. We have tremendously high property taxes that drive the cost of everything else, including energy. So,
very interesting. I wanted others with a take on the corporate tax issue, by the way. Anybody else on the panel? Or?
Well, for me, with small business, it comes down to the millionaires tax and
Right.
tax code overhaul, and the attempt to continue to get those S corps and the small business owner that pay their business tax through the personal income tax always get lumped in as a millionaire. My predecessor would always say that they're millionaire, at 3/4 discount, and it's an unfortunate systematic problem. Now, while the tax code overhaul did sort of address I mean, for the S corp piece of it, a little bit, we're still uncompetitive compared to many states around us.
If I could also jump in there real quick, I mean, Heather's point about the global perspective is huge. I mean, taking a look at where the U.S. is, the OECD average of countries, almost all of them have reduced their corporate marginal rates over the last 10 years. The United States has not, kept it at 35. You add the state and local rates in, you get the effective rate up a pretty significant level. The other thing is, of course, the United States uses a worldwide tax system where many of our trading partners use territorial systems, which additionally complicates for U.S.-based companies. And then you take a look at, New York, where the marginal rate here at the state level, especially if you're doing business in the city and making profits in the city, is certainly up there among the highest in the country. And then, also to the point that Heather made, a great study came out of the Council on State Taxation in the last couple of months showing that, many business taxes are being paid, many corporate form of business taxes are paid in non-corporate income tax, like business property tax and some of the others. And so when you add all those up, I think it's certainly a big problem here.